Yo! So, Supergirl is finally here, people. I have to say, going into it, I was personally super excited for it. Right now, as there's not that much DCU content, it was refreshing going back and watching everything right before this came out. I am also a huge fan of the comic this is based on, Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow. And so this felt like the recipe for a slam dunk. A no-brainer. I sat down and watched the movie excitedly with a smile on my face. And then when it ended, what was I thinking? I was saying, what? This might be one of the biggest emotional roller coasters I've ever had for a comic book film, because so many things about this are so cool and unique, but it feels like immediately whenever I get the slightest bit of joy, I will get hit with some of the most bafflingly lifeless scenes in recent comic book history. But first, let's start off slow. Let's start with what I find to be the most universally good thing about this movie, which I would say is the performances. Millie Alcock as Supergirl is pretty good. I had a small worry going into it that she would be very bluntly brash and unreasonably mean to double down on her punk attitude that separates her from her cousin, but instead, I think we get some interesting subtlety. I think this stretches out to the whole vibe of the movie, but Kara is super over the plot the moment it starts, and throughout the story, Millie gives a rightfully relaxed performance that seems like the type of person that constantly is always having to face danger to help others. It really does feel like Kara doesn't reject Clark's worldview and optimism, and instead somewhat wishes she could see the world that way, which I thought was actually kind of neat. Then we get Lobo. Hey, listen, he isn't in this movie that much, but he's pretty neat as well. Jason Momoa doesn't really do enough to give me a lasting impression, but his seemingly passionate desire to play this character was pretty infectious, and so I can't help but respect that. But then I would say after those two are out of the way, and the few cameos David Cornsweet has later on in the movie, we have a bunch of performances that I think are kind of forgettable. Now, Ruthie, I'm gonna save most of my complaints with her for the spoiler section, but I will say her actress did the best she could do. It sucks that effectively she was written to be really annoying and flat, and so that's really all she gets to be here. Now, Krem isn't very memorable either, but I will defend that character specifically because, like I said, having this movie be purposefully redundant to Kara and making the focus on her being introspective is a decision I support. It also, in theory, should allow Ruth to develop as a character in the present while we learn about Kara when we intercut to her flashbacks. But that leads me to the much more conflicting thing. The direction. Craig Gillespie. Hold on, I should probably look this up.
Craig Gillespie.
Gillespie. Craig Gillespie is not James Gunn, but this movie does feel very much like a James Gunn movie. And in regards to how I feel about that, I can't really place my finger on it yet. On the one hand, yes, sci-fi adventures with licensed music are this guy's bread and butter, so I can see why instinctually it feels so off. But on the other hand, I do feel like every choice the movie has for its visuals and audio is inspired. To start off with the licensed music, after 30 minutes of a new licensed song playing back to back every 2 minutes, I started to frankly get a little annoyed. I was like, damn bro, chill. It's not that serious. It felt like the songs didn't really serve a purpose and were just trying to set the vibe without much thought into the individual songs, which felt lazy. But right as my patience was running out, we come to see that the music was actually a coping mechanism for Kara to block out her superhearing on Earth, and more metaphorically, her new identity as Supergirl. So right when I was out, they got me back in. I thought that was pretty good characterization, and it was a pretty nice way to blend it into the movie. Yo, wait, maybe the music is actually fire? And since James Gunn decided to move over to giving Superman a more traditional score in his movie, I like the decision to give the more expressive music to Kara to differentiate. But then in the last act, out of nowhere, the movie decides to just reject everything I said and give me some atrociously misplaced needle drops. Why was this music trying to aura farm? DC, please. I'm trying my best to like your movie. Why are you making it so hard? The movie also has the Herculean task of trying to capture the visuals of the comic, which is honestly one of the most beautiful graphic novels I've ever read. To be real, I have a lot of comic book blind spots I have not read yet, but as of right now, it's gonna be really hard to top this. And because of just how cracked the book looks, I can see why they went with a different aesthetic entirely. I can at the very least respect it. Whatever is needed to translate a work from one medium to another is okay with me. And so even if I wasn't necessarily expecting this, I do believe there is some merit to it. Specifically, I was a big fan of how Krypton looked a lot like Dune when we saw it in the flashbacks. In past Superman iterations, Krypton is usually seen as a big, cold, monolithic setting filled with lots of white. And then when James Gunn decided to make his movie, he also made his style very cold and blue. So by the time we get to Supergirl, we get a movie that is much warmer and fills its version of Krypton with lots of yellow that helps it stand out. Especially since Kryptonians have so many relations to the different types of suns, it's cool to make the sunlight its most defining feature. Then, in the present, they went for a more neon approach, with lots of dark and neutral base colors, with usually one thing or a person on screen being the brightest to make it stand out more. The style, while obviously not looking like the comic, did win me over until the final act, but we'll get to that. So that's all the things I can talk about without spoiling the plot, which means if we want to keep going, then now we have to enter the spoiler section. Skip to the time code here if you want to avoid spoilers. Only spoiler people should be watching right now. Spoiler free people leave. Cool. So I've been beating around the bush decently up to this point, but this movie has a unique premise of not only being an original movie for the DCU, but also being a direct adaptation of Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow. And I have to say, if you go into this movie without any conception to the book or anything it's about, it is most likely that you will like it more than me. I'm not a comic book purist by any means. If it makes for a more interesting story, I am perfectly okay with things being changed around. Every remix of the source material is a case-by-case basis in my book. But for this movie specifically, in my opinion, I think almost unanimously, every single thing they changed about the book is only for the worse. So now it's time we talk about Ruthie a little bit more. In the original comic, she was the main character. She was the surrogate for the audience experiencing Kara through an outsider's perspective, and for most of the book, the writing is nothing but her internal monologue describing what she learns and is inspired by when seeing Kara's actions. When adapting from a comic to a movie, you can't really make most of it someone talking in their head, but you at least have to replace it with something. They cut all of her monologues, but give her nothing in exchange, which leads Ruthie to become a wet fart of a character. She's genuinely forgettable in this movie, which is friggin' crazy when her arc in the original comic was so moving. The movie is also supposed to be just like Superman in the sense that it is meant to be paced like you're in a large world that's already lived in and with a lot to discover. If there's anything to know about me, I pay attention to pacing in movies a lot. I like that. And in this one, I feel like the journey is incredibly rushed. It reminded me of the recent Fantastic Four movie, where the creators felt really insecure about boring the audience, and so they played it safe and cut a bunch of stuff out to make it simpler. Some of the planets from the original comics are cut, which would have helped diversify the aesthetics a bit, and the stuff we do see doesn't feel like it wants to delve in all the way. Bro, in the comic, Kara rides a unicorn! Why is that not here? Some of the more subtle world buildings, like having Kara use red kryptonite to get really strong instead of her just needing a regular sun, seems really strange to me. I guess they don't want to overwhelm audiences with the idea there's other colors of kryptonite out there. I would have wanted to see Superman with the pink kryptonite personally. But nothing is as egregious in this movie as making the most beautiful planet in the book into this weird CGI Mad Max planet. I will never diss on Furiosa's visuals not being as good as Fury Road's ever again, because I see now just how low the bar can go. This shit look like poop from a butt, but it's so frustrating because sometimes you'd have a pretty decent shot sprinkled in as well. This movie's so conflicting, bruh. And then having Kara kill Krem does work, but I don't think it will ever match the catharsis of the original. I know that for this complaint, I'm being especially unfair because no way they do a 50-year time skip on movie 2 of a new universe, but a man can only yearn. However, I'll stop being mean for a second because there is one thing I'm really happy they clarified, and that was arguably the most debated thing about Superman. This movie tells us that Jor-El's ideals are uniquely exclusive to him and Clark's mom, to the point that Kara's dad didn't even allow him to escape with them because he thought Jor-El was best to be left alone. This does clarify that Krypton isn't an evil and maniacal planet, which I already pretty much assumed from Superman, but now I can breathe a sigh of relief. I could nitpick more stuff about how the flashbacks weren't placed in the same spots as the comic and why it makes it slightly worse or not, but honestly, you guys get the point. So Supergirl as a whole is a movie I want to love so badly, but I think there's so many weird changes that I just can't fully defend it. Does this mean that the DCU is cooked? I don't really know. It's definitely not as bad as most of Marvel's first phase of movies, but That's not really saying a lot. And we are quite far out from when that phase happened. The industry has changed a lot, and so I feel like our standards also should be up. But I guess we'll just have to see how the rest of the DCU stuff pans out for the rest of 2026. And so, for now, even though I wanted to give it a 7 really badly, I would give Supergirl a 6 out of 10.